I'd like to thank you all for being here this evening, and welcome to one of St. Mary's greatest conversations with world-renowned systems thinker Peter Senge and our leadership studies faculty member Elissa Perry. My name's Jennifer Pigza, and I'm the academic chair of the MA in Leadership to Social Justice concentration, and I'm also the associate director of the Catholic Institute for Lasallian Social Action. Peter Senge's presence here is made possible by leadership studies programs, the Office of the Provost, the Kalmanovitz School of Education, the School of Economics and Business Administration, and the undergraduate major of Justice, Community, and Leadership. We're pleased to be part of De La Salle Week offerings, and we offer a special welcome this evening to President Jim Donahue, Provost Beth Dobkin, and I'm not sure if he's arrived yet, Vice Provost Chris Sint, and Dean of the School of Education. Tonight, we'll wonder out loud together about the question, what kind of learning is necessary to sustain change in systems and organizations? So to give you a little context about why something like this might be part of De La Salle Week, John Baptiste de La Salle, founder of the Christian Brothers, operated within the social, political, religious, and economic systems and organizations of 17th century France. In response to the stagnating poverty that he saw, and let's not forget the persistent presence of his friend Adrien Nael, de La Salle had his own journey of learning about systems and organization and making change. Today, De La Salle's tradition and spirit are alive and functioning in 81 countries around the world and more than 1,000 educational institutions. And our presence here tonight at St. Mary's College is evidence of how leadership enacted by individuals and groups over a period of centuries can create lasting change. In many ways, De La Salle was an agent of systemic change, though I doubt he maybe thought of himself that way at the time. How are the questions and challenges that De La Salle faced also perennial questions about leadership, change, systems, relationships, and learning, not only in the educational and religious sectors in which he worked, but across all types of work and life? And that's what Peter Senge's visit to St. Mary's is about. Earlier this afternoon, Peter participated in a working session with about 25 leadership studies faculty, graduate students, and alumni. Together, they explored the notion of communities in practice, ways to encourage long-term engagement with learning and development, ways to grow communities. And tonight, again, we're exploring necessary learning for systemic change. So before we introduce Peter and Elissa, a couple housekeeping notes. Tonight's presentation will be approximately 90 minutes. We'll have conversation a la City Arts and Lectures style here with Peter and Elissa, and then there will be an open forum for conversation and questions from the audience. Out of respect for our guest speakers, we asked you to silence all of your electronic devices. But if you are so inclined, you may use social media. If you want to, you can post things with the hashtag OMGSMC or hashtag, that's our official shout out to St. Mary's. Good things that happen here, good things people here said here. So hashtag OMGSMC or hashtag SMC leadership. Any moment this evening you hear something, you from a colleague, you have an insight, feel free to use that with social media. I now invite Marguerite Welch, the academic chair for the MA in Leadership, to come forward to introduce our speakers. After their conversation, Ken Otter, who is the director of Leadership Studies programs, will come forward to facilitate the open forum. So again, thank you all for being here and hope we all have a great evening.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's really wonderful to see so many familiar faces in the audience. It took me a while to get up here hugging everybody. Um, but I want to introduce you to Peter Senge and Elissa Perry, and it's my great honor to be able to do so. We spent the afternoon with Peter, and I want to just start with a quote that really connects his work to the work we do here at St. Mary's. He was sharing a story about a group of young people in a suburb of Boston, and asking them to talk about what leadership was. They were sitting in a circle, and one of them said, "Leadership is doing what is good for the whole." And it just made so much sense when I heard that I wanted to share it with you all. But a bit about Peter. Many of you may be familiar with his work, The Fifth Discipline, the art and practice of learning organizations, and if you're not, I highly recommend you take a peek at it. He is a senior lecturer in leadership and sustainability at the MIT Sloan School of Management. I'm going to read you a little bit about what it says about him on the website there. It says he studies decentralizing the role of leadership in organizations so as to enhance the ability of employees to work productively towards common goals and the managerial and institutional changes needed to build more sustainable enterprises, those businesses that foster social and natural as well as economic well-being. His work articulates a cornerstone position of human values in the workplace, namely that vision, purpose, reflectiveness, and systems thinking are essential if organizations are to realize their potential. He has worked with leaders in business, education, civil society, healthcare, and government, and I'm sure you'll hear a little bit more about that in the conversation this evening with Elissa. So on to Elissa. Elissa Perry has been a member of our faculty for, I don't know, many years, and she teaches the leadership series, social movements and values and ethics, and our course called The Future of Leadership. It's wonderful to have her here in conversation with Peter this evening. She's worked for over 15 years as a staff leader, consultant, teacher, and coach with individuals, organizations, and initiatives in the areas of leadership, education, and the arts. She works with cross-sector, diverse, multi-issue learning communities in developing and implementing leadership plans and practices. What she brings to the work she does with our learners in two conversations is an additional perspective of diversity, power, privilege, the nonprofit industry, the arts, and recent social movements. We're very pleased to have her as a member of our faculty and this evening to talk with Peter. So now let's begin the conversation.
All right. How's that?
Okay.
All right. Great.
Can you hear me too? Maybe have to do with the fact that the mic is falling down by my belly. Okay, first. Okay, now it's working, so that's not the problem. Okay.
All right.
So, yeah.
Very good. Wow. Well, I just want to thank you again for being here with us. It's a real
My pleasure.
honor to be in this conversation with you. And before we get into exploring what's necessary, what's needed to sustain change in organizations and systems, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what sort of set you on this path to start with, about communities and organizations, how they learn, how they evolve, how they change.
Well, actually, there's only been one question for me for as long as I can really remember. And it really has to do with understanding systems. And so organizations, communities, they're all just examples of this. But it's not an easy thing to explain because the word system is such a crazy word. I mean, most people hear the word system, they think computer system. Or, hey, it's not my fault, it's the stupid system, right? So neither of it is exactly what I mean there. I grew up here. I grew up in California. I grew up in LA. And the easiest way to explain it is just to kind of summarize one thing that was like the maybe almost, I guess, certainly the most disquieting aspect of growing up. When I was a young kid living in LA, it's hard to believe this today, but it was paradise. It really was. I mean, we were never inside. I must have played baseball 360 days a year. I mean, the weather was spectacular. You would drive for miles and miles. I lived in the San Fernando Valley. All you'd see was orange groves and lemon groves. And within 10 years, literally just like that, it was all gone. I mean, by the time I was ready to go to college, there'd be days when they had to keep the kids in because the air was so bad. You couldn't see the mountains anymore. It was surrounded by mountains, but you never saw them. And all the orange groves and lemon groves were shopping malls. And it was such a startling experience. Now, today in the world, you go in the developing world particularly, a lot of people experience that. Shanghai changed in 8 years. I mean, it was just astounding how rapidly the whole city was just decimated. I mean, literally, they tore down half of the traditional buildings. And so that pattern of extraordinarily rapid and disruptive development is a phenomenon that actually occurs all around the world. We don't experience it so much here in the US because our rate of development and population growth slowed quite a long time ago. I think maybe LA, maybe Phoenix were the last two cities that went through this kind of explosive, I guess I would say, deterioration. And the one question that really crystallized from that experience is a very simple one. How did this happen? And what I mean by this is that I think you'd be really hard-pressed to find anybody who thought that it was better afterwards than before. Seriously, I mean, it was so beautiful. It was so easy for people. I'm not saying it was easy for everybody. I'm not saying it was a perfect world. I don't mean to characterize it as paradise. But if you had your choice of orange groves and lemon groves or strip malls and huge parking lots, what would you choose? And if you had your choice of clear air and beautiful mountains or really bad air pollution and you couldn't go outdoors, which would you choose? That started me to kind of appreciate a particular problem, and I think it's the problem we see all over, which is that in the pursuit of the things we think make sense, very often the unintended side effects completely swamp the intended effects. And there is I don't know how to say this, there's kind of a level of agency, maybe causality would be the right word, in the world that generally is invisible to us. I mean, you tick off any list of the problems that most concern you, not at the personal level, but more at the collective level particularly. And just ask yourself, who is trying to make those happen?
Who's trying to make the problems happen?
Whose efforts are consciously embodied in those problems? I mean, who wakes up in the morning and says, hey, look, a beautiful day, I think I'll try to destroy some species? But that's what we do. Who wants the drought in California? Which obviously is around the corner. I mean, it's here, but it's not really here yet. I mean, the only reason we haven't yet seen the impact on agriculture and food prices throughout the country is that they're rapidly pumping down the groundwater throughout the San Joaquin Valley. So they're compensating for the diminished surface water by just going deeper and deeper and deeper. Well, that won't last for very long. And you can just go on and on and on. Climate destabilization, inequity, it's always hard to hold the scope of inequity. Every kind of week or two we hear some new statistic, and it's like sort of mind-boggling. 300 people have a third of the wealth in the world. Crazy things like this. I mean, just bizarre. And if you ask yourself, whose goal is any of this? And the answer is generally nobody's. I mean, I'm not saying rich people don't want to be rich, but do they want to be that much more rich than everybody else, which is a surefire formula for social instability? So that was it. I think ever since I grew up, I've had that one question. how does all this coming about? It's not bad luck.
So what
It's
have you
not an
found?
accident. It's a systematic consequence of all kinds of actions we take, but at a scale we can't see.
So what have you found in investigating that scale?
Well, I think it's all the stuff that we've come to call, understanding systems thinking, complexity, the lack of reflectiveness. It's you just call it a massive collective blind spot. As I don't think people really think so much about this. I think people say, oh, well, there's inequity, massive inequity in America. There must be some bad people out there who are making this happen. Or, well, we've always had the poor. It's inevitable. Or whatever. I think we operate with very thick layers of denial and really confusion, frankly.
So actually earlier today, you said something that intrigued me, that rang as a truth. You said communities can survive as much as they make opportunities for people to connect and contribute.
Right.
So what bright spots are you seeing out there, and what does this instruct us to think about
Well,
and do?
at some other level, you can step back and say, well, this is kind of the way real change occurs in the living world, in the natural world. There's some dominance of some species or set of ecosystems, and they become increasingly destructive to their own well-being. They're gradually kind of in collapse mode, but then that also creates a space for the new. And I think the new is all around. I mean, that's the thing that's as hard for people to see, that, what's really needed is actually occurring in the world, in my experience. But you have to kind of know how to see it. And it's all over. But it's occurring at the same time that this kind of mainstream collapse is unfolding. So that's, of course, what you see the most of. You see the symptoms of the collapse. You don't see what's really being born. But I have no doubt there is. I mentioned that organization today when we were talking, ROCA, which is now so ROCA is just to take a very local example, of course, where I live, stands for ROC in Spanish, and it's a community youth organization, been going for 27, 28 years, very poor area, just about a mile from downtown Boston, called Chelsea. And ROCA has gotten so good at getting kids who, basically, they've always said, we work with the kids nobody will work with. The ones who've dropped out of every job training program, and they got no place to go. And they've gotten so good at this that they now have a historic contract with the Commonwealth, the state of Massachusetts, where they get paid to keep kids out of jail. And the way it works is pretty simple. I mean, it's a reflection of the irony. Incarceration is so predictive in America. They can literally build jails. So they plan jail capacity 10, 15 years in advance, often based on third grade test scores. And of course, it's enormously concentrated in the African American population, both male and increasingly female. So, basically, the other side of that coin is that you can look at a population and you can basically say with a high level of confidence, this population will cost the Commonwealth, this 100 young people, will cost the Commonwealth, $40,000 per year for the next 50 years, 30 years. Because we know how much it costs to incarcerate people. We know the odds of that population, how many are going to be in jail. So they get paid. And so they work with that 100 young people, and for everyone that's below the expected number, they get paid. That's amazing. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, know the social service sector, and in almost every organization of this sort gets funded to do programs, as did ROCA for years. But their programs became so effective that they're now literally paid for results, which is, in my opinion, historic. There's some of you may have heard there's more and more talk about social bonds and other ways of funding social service organizations today. And that's because some of them are getting quite sophisticated. I don't mean that in a technical sense. Roca's core methodology they learned from the Tlingit Indians. They call it peacekeeping circles, and it's very common tools within the restorative justice movement. But they've put it together with an extraordinary performance management system where they literally track every interaction of every caseworker with every young person in a big database, and they're continually analyzing their intervention model. I mean, they're as sophisticated as most any business would be in its business operation, but what they're dealing with is youth at extreme risk. Kids who would otherwise either be in jail or dead within 5 years of when they start working with them. So there's incredible stories like that out there. And, you know, I just have the good fortune, I get to bump into a lot of them.
Yeah. What are you seeing that's common among those stories that connects to, I know lately you've been focused on and were part of writing about social and emotional learning in educational systems and youth development systems.
Well, it's been a lot of fun to be here today. And, you know, I knew nothing about the master's program in leadership here. I've met a few of the people in the past, but just, you know, in bigger groups with workshops and stuff. Never a chance to really get to know it. And I think a lot of you can see it present in this program. The kind of first paradox you have to embrace around real systemic change, it's a very personal deal. You know, again, the very words sound like, oh, well, changing the system. Well, first off, only a president or somebody up there can do that. And it sounds very technical and, oh, yeah, well, we got to change the system here. Or hopeless. You know, usually it either sounds too technical or too hopeless. But my favorite definition, actually, of systemic change comes from the people at Roca, who have transformed the way policing works in Chelsea, and now when they work, they're being paid to do this, and they're going to cities all over Massachusetts, and they typically build partnership. It takes usually 5 years or more with the police, who used to be the people they fought with, because, you know, you're kind of trying to help these youth kids at risk. You know, the cops are not your friends. But I've met a lot of the former police chief in Chelsea, an Irish cop, you know, perfect kind of icon of a Boston policeman, says his life was transformed by working with Roca. He said, I never thought we could do anything to actually reduce crime. We could just, you know, ameliorate the impacts. He said, I think we can really reduce it significantly. So these kind of deep changes in how systems work are very subtle. Roca's definition of systemic change is incremental shifts in habit. I mean, you got to ponder that one. Incremental shifts in habit. First off, most people don't like incremental. Oh, we want profound change. We don't want incremental change. Well, you look at any change in your life, I'll guarantee you, it's incremental, it's step by step. Even if there's a traumatic event or a dramatic single thing that happens, the real lasting impacts occur gradually over time. And habit, you know, that's a kind of a mundane word, but that's the way the world works. The world works based on habit. You know, attitudes, values, habitual ways of interacting are the toughest things to change. And of course, they're not just individual. At one level, they are. We each have our habits, but they're embedded in us because of how we grew up, our families, our communities of origin, wherever. That's where the habits come from. So yeah, we're individual, but we're a manifestation of a collective, always. So when you really ponder that, incremental shifts in habit is a very profound business. But you're saying that to change the system out there, you got to change the system in here. I actually think it's an illusion that there's even a difference. But we can talk about that later if you want.
We can talk about it now.
But that's the nature. That's the nature of real systemic change. It's very deep, it's very personal, and it's very manifest. We often say, in a kind of more technical lingo, what defines any system are habits of thought, habits of action, and artifacts. The artifacts are all the manifest stuff. You know, so how an organization is structured, what you measure, what you don't measure, all the stuff people usually talk about when they say, well, you got to change the system. Well, they're right about those things, of course. But what they're usually not paying attention to is, why are they that way? Why do we measure what we measure? Why do we organize the way we organize? Why do we have that policy versus this policy? And if you examine that question carefully, you'll always see it's a result of assumptions, values, taken for granted things of what's got to happen. So habits of thought, habits of action, artifacts, that is what defines a system.
So if we think about those habits of mind, practice, thought, your experience with Roca or observation of them, and what we're understanding now as intersecting systems of injustice in places like Ferguson and other places in our country around economic justice, racial justice, all sorts of questions. What should we be asking? What are the questions we should be asking?
Well, I'm not sure I know the answers, but I mean, I think. Well, I think we have to, one, recognize our own habit to point fingers and say, well, it's those folks that are causing the problem. Systems work the way they work because of the way we work. You know, again, how we think, how we interact, our ways of doing things. So that's the first thing. You know, you might say the first thing is stop doing certain things we are habitually inclined to do, which is blame others, and recognize that if it's a deep problem, not just an incident that occurred here and there, or not something you would say is really likely to be really recurring and growing. If it's a deep problem that's likely to recur and grow, we're all part of it. And then secondly, don't wait till you figure it all out, because you won't. This is the other part of the systems perspective that is not easy one for people to embrace. But actually the world's infinitely complex, and it's profoundly uncertain. If you sit around and wait till you got it all figured out, you've now wasted a lot of time. So the same way you learn to walk, the same way you learn to do anything, you learn by doing. Now that's one thing to do at the individual level. It's obviously quite another thing to do when it involves lots of people. Because learning by doing means taking a lot of risks. Because you learn to walk by falling down a lot.
Yeah.
So if you're in the public light, and you got to get people working together, and say, well, we do not have an answer here. We're going to get to work on it. And the only thing we can be certain of is we're going to screw up a lot. That's a tough one. It's real tough for political folks to embrace that. And I think that's the second thing. You have to kind of embrace the profound uncertainty and inherent interdependence and complexity of genuinely embedded, difficult problems in life. But we know that. If you think there's 3 steps to follow to be a good parent, you're really delusional. Or to be a good partner, or whatever, or whatever, or whatever. Life is not like that. Life is not about the rule book. It's about learning through doing. And so why should it be less complex when we're dealing with these big systemic problems? So I guess one third point, it's kind of implication of that, is we need a lot of tolerance for our own shortcomings, for each other's shortcomings, for, as I said, the inevitable kind of path we'll follow in real changes, which is not going to be a straight line. It's going to be a meander. It's not going to work out really well. It's funny. In the business world, I've seen a huge shift in this in the last 20, 30 years. The 2 things I've noticed that I think are really profound changes, and these aren't true equally for every single business, but they're true to varying degrees. In some industries, they're true on a very large scale. First off is people understand teams. It's really unusual to have a job in most any business beyond something really, really small, where you're not part of teams. That didn't used to be the case. So this idea that we got to work together, we got to collaborate, you're not going to figure it out. It's not a matter of just doing what the boss tells you to do. Yeah, sure, people still may have elements of that, but that's a culture that's really fading very rapidly. And the second is as they say in a lot of the tech industries, fail fast and early. A real attitude that get out there and do it. And the only thing you can be sure is it won't work, but do it quickly and learn quickly. Now that's life. That's a really interesting maturation in perspective. Didn't used to be true hardly ever in the business world, and now again, various company to company, industry to industry. The software industry is really interesting. I never thought I'd be interested in software per se as an industry, but they have crossed a threshold. Nobody knows how software works, really. If they tell you the truth. The real pros in the industry will tell you the software environments are now so complex, they're getting to be like a forest. No one knows how a forest works. It's a living system that works, and it's beyond our comprehension. Believe it or not, the real leaders in the software industry will tell you, today, you introduce a new element of software in these enormously complex software environments, and you have only one thing to look forward to. It's not going to work the way you intend, and you better fail fast and early and learn. So you've adopted a very interesting philosophy of try it. You think a lot, you think as much as you can, but used to be typical cycles for a lot of software would be 9 months. Now it's like 1 to 3, 4 weeks, because you're doing little steps and trying to see what happens. So I personally consider that a profound shift in worldview. And I think it's not true in all industries, and it's certainly not true in most of society still. We're still operating, by and large, in the old machine age idea that you figure it out, you design it correctly, and then you go implement it. You didn't learn walking by implementing walking. It's crazy. It's a totally nutso point of view. You didn't learn bicycle riding by figuring it out and implementing bicycle riding. We all know how we learn these things. We fall down a lot. And so yet still we didn't internalize that innate knowledge, and we created this whole worldview, and it's infected all the schools. The schools all became about right answers and wrong answers. Totally nuts. When was the last time you had a real problem that had a right answer? As opposed to the wrong answer. You have more effective things and less effective things, and nothing's perfect. There's no the right answer. So all that stuff was kind of an artifice that crept into the mainstream of our institutions, and now we're kind of slowly, gradually weeding it out.
So that was a perfect segue. So in systems, institutions and systems like education, where this idea, this stance, this way of being is not embraced, how can they come to understand themselves as living systems when we know that in complexity, there are no existing solutions you can pick up from over here and plop down over here and have it work.
Exactly.
The people with the challenge have to come up with the solution.
Well, there's a short answer, but no one likes it. Ask the kids. Guess who is not yet brainwashed fully? Guess who has, 2 feet firmly planted in the future, not the past? The person with the least power in the system. It's not unusual. The people with the least power in the system have the most understanding of how the craziness of it. No. I mean, I'm not saying, they'd have all the answers, because there aren't answers. But, if you could actually imagine school as a continual unfolding of the natural development process of a human being, it'd be a very different place. It would be a lot messier. It would be a lot more chaotic. You walk into any of the classrooms, we have a whole network of, we just call them sometimes the system schools, public schools, kind of implementing systems thinking in kind of pre-K through 12 education. The only 2 things I can always tell you you'll see is the classrooms will be very noisy, and you'll never see chairs in a straight line, ever. These kids are all working together. They're all teaching each other stuff. The teacher's a designer, a facilitator, and it's really hard. It's a big shift for a teacher.
What does leadership look like in that context?
That is leadership. Leadership designs and enables. It doesn't control.
How are they developing leadership so that they can design and enable in those systems?
Well, as I said, it is never hard for the kids.
Yeah.
But it's super hard for the adults, because it's understandable. After 30, 40 years of immersed in this, we got to control it worldview, it's a little bit of unlearning to do. It's a wonderful line in the Tao Te Ching, and in the pursuit of gain, every day something is learned. In the pursuit of the Tao, every day something is unlearned.
Wow. Can you say that again for us?
In the pursuit of gain, every day something is learned. In the pursuit of the Tao, every day something is unlearned. There's a lot of unlearning to do for the adults. But, at one level, it's not rocket science. I mean, I've watched the master educators. We've had a wonderful opportunity to work with some extraordinarily sophisticated educators who've all worked in, public education, are passionate about public education, particularly urban school districts, places where we have the toughest problems. Because ironically, I think a lot of times places where you have the toughest problems, you also have the greatest opportunity. People know things have got to change. Anyhow, I do really good, 2-3 day introductory trainings, very hands-on. People will leave knowing how to do something they couldn't do when they came in because they really practice. There's a lot of autonomy for the teachers to figure out how they want to implement particular tools, let's say systems learning tools or ladder of inference or different tools like this they're learning. But then there's a lot of good coaching and most importantly, a real emphasis on peer coaching networks. So how you get teachers helping teachers, because that's the only really robust support structure. The trainings are great, the external coaches are really useful, but at some point, the people got to help each other. And once you build enough of those kind of strong peer networks, then, and they have some ideas of where they're going, and they have some tools, and they get good guidance from the outside. But the day-to-day doing is always, you're going to try something in your class and it's not going to work. So you can wait till your coach comes by in 3 months, or you can go next door and say, hey, have you tried that? Did you see what happened in my class? So that's where the learning has got to be. It's got to be with the partners. Now, when they get to a certain point, this is a big step of maturity, so this is a progressive process. It's a developmental process. I have literally seen some of the teachers try something new, stop and go with their, room full of 8, 9-year-olds and go, hey, how do you think this is working? And they immediately go into clinic mode. And the kids will say, well, that kind of worked, this didn't kind of work, and, you should try it a little differently. And, to find a teacher who's that secure, who can stop in the middle of something and ask the kids for real-time feedback. And you can imagine what this does to the sense of efficacy of the kids. Yeah. Because now they really are learning together with their teachers. And, when you describe things like that, people go, oh my God, the authority is gone. The kids aren't going to respect the teacher anymore. Baloney. You can imagine how the kids feel about a teacher who's an adult, who's been working for 20 or 30 years to learn and improve her or his craft, who's so confident in a way that they can ask the kids how it's going. Believe me, the respect goes up dramatically, because we all know respect is mutual, right? If I feel respected, my likelihood to respect you goes up dramatically. So that's kind of the gist of it. It's a progressive developmental process, but we've really learned that the real focus in the first 2 or 3 years is on the strength of those peer networks and creating a culture within a school where teachers can really help each other and administrators and teachers can help each other. And gradually, you find ways to make it real mutual, including the kids.
It sounds like in addition to returning to the human and the humane, it's returning teachers to actually educing, drawing out the exactly. Real root of educating. I have to pause and ask Jennifer, I didn't understand my time signal. Okay, thank you.
So I think that's more true than probably it's almost impossible for us to recognize. Because, in a sense, we've all got these images of school, but they've all been shaped by the last 100 to 200 years. Depends what part of the world you're in. If you're in China, the last 50 years, because that's when the Western industrial school has swept across urban China. But in our part of the world, it's the industrial age is last 150, 200 years. So we think that's the way it always was. And I'm sure there's lots of different types of schools because there's lots of different types of societies. But, having had a chance to kind of think about this and get to know a little bit about really old notions of learning and teaching. In China, I spend about a month a year in China. I have for about 15 years. Partly because I've been a lifelong interest in traditional Asian cultures. So the contemporary word in China for education didn't exist. It's a new word, Xiaoye. It just only came into China in the last 100 years or so with colonization and the influence of the West. But there was an older term. And when I was listening to the way you phrased that, all I could think of was Zhaohua. So Zhaohua literally means teaching so as to transform. And it was considered the work not only of teachers, but of managers, of government officials, of basically anybody who was in any kind of position of authority with anybody. What are you transforming? Well, in that philosophic system, you're transforming what they would call the prenatal seeds. The deepest aspects of your nature, because of course in their worldview, that's over many, many embodiments. But in fact, you don't have to think in a karmic term to understand this. You're transforming the deepest aspects of your nature that takes you away from your genuine nature, from your compassion, from your insight, from your prajna, your wisdom. And that's what teaching is all about. I only know that because I've had the good fortune to be involved in one really wild and crazy project in China, first school since the Cultural Revolution started, based upon the way kids were educated 2,000 years ago. And now people from all over China come to study at this school. And it's amazing. Kids start off the day doing Tai Chi because they have to understand mind-body, unison or harmony. They do calligraphy because actually in the traditional Chinese education system, they didn't do much with kind of rational, analytic, conceptual stuff until 8 or 9 years old because they thought kids weren't really ready for it. But they're ready for the creative process at the earliest age. They're ready to learn how to concentrate. I have a photo on my computer. I think it's about an 8-year-old girl doing her calligraphy. And you just look at it, and you cannot not kind of profoundly appreciate the ability to concentrate, which, of course, today is a species at risk, right? Because the ability to do one thing and fully be present doing that one thing, they consider, well, that's really important by the age of 7 or 8. You better be able to concentrate. And then they did something which was the only kind of content stuff called recitation. The kids recite Confucius, Mencius, the classics, the Chinese classics. And Western educators said, oh, that's really stupid, just rote memorization. There's nothing to that at all. Today, by the way, brain scientists are starting to realize that rote memorization is really important in brain development, even though it fell out of fashion 50 years ago. But what was really important in the Chinese system, because the Chinese language is a tonal language, all you have to do is be in one of these rooms with the kids reciting Confucius. It doesn't matter they understand anything. I once talked to one person, this system was eradicated in China, in the Cultural Revolution. But I once met an elderly guy in Malaysia who'd been educated like this. He was like in his late 80s. And I said, wow, you did recitation? Oh, he said, we all did recitation. That's all kids did. It was your basic of your education was recitation. I said, did you understand any of that when you were 6 years old? He said, oh, of course not. I understood it when I was 42. Because you're taking in all this deep wisdom. Okay, so there's the long-term effect. But the really interesting part is, given the tonal structure of the Chinese language, the traditional system of education in China, if you go back 1,500 or 2,000 years ago, was kids spent 2 hours a day chanting. Because it was understood that the foundation for social harmony was literally this embodied knowledge of creating a vibrational field together. So in our kind of the West, you imagine you spend 2 hours a day singing, because that's the closest we get. It's not too dissimilar in a lot of ways. Because they considered the understanding the mind-body system and understanding the creative process, and understanding the most fundamental, non-cognitive, embodied, emotional, somatic, embodied, emotional understanding of harmony to be the key for how a society would work.
Wow.
Yeah. So, it wasn't always like it is.
You indulge me one more question connected to that.
Sure.
Which is, so Holly Sidford, who's a researcher who researches brain science and art, said recently that art is the spirit, this individual spirit and the collective spirit moving in motion. And we're in danger of losing our souls.
Yeah, that's really beautiful.
So in that story you just told us about the schools and in Roca and the other bright spots you're seeing out there, how is art and the creative process individually and collectively a part of understanding organizational and systemic change?
That's a wonderful question. Well, I mean, the kind of abstract, but I think kind of essential answer is that all real changes has an aesthetic dimension. I mean, you can have a plan. You need a plan, of course. You have strategies, you have tools, all that stuff. You need all those things. But it's your sense. It's literally your awareness of the unfolding energy. So it's not too different than dancing together or singing together. I mean, there's an aesthetic to real change. But I think in a more maybe operational level, I think you were implying it by your question. It's hard for us to appreciate, and it's a long time, it's been many generations, this steady loss of the arts. That was culture. Culture was our songs, our dances, our stories, our poems, our visual art, that defined us. And that's been steadily deteriorating for many, many generations, to the point where, no school can afford an art budget anymore, right? So I think when you appreciate the role of the creative process, that little story I was telling you about the calligraphy, it's a small example, the role of the creative process in our development. And I think, at some point we'll have all kinds of good brain research, as maybe this lady is showing, that really kind of helps us understand it. I always think, I have a very mixed feelings about brain research. It's like, do we really need a reductionistic study of which neuronal networks are active and what's activity to tell us what we intuitively know already? But yes, the answer is yes. Unfortunately, in this modern, crazy, materialistic world, if the scientists say it's true, it must be true. But I think that there's two dimensions to it. One is the individual, so that kind of ability to really appreciate the creative process. And the other, of course, is the collective. And that's why the recitation is such a good example. The dancing, the singing, the telling stories together, that collective harmonization that develops that way, we have no idea the costs of losing both of those.
Well, I thank you. I think it's time for us to have questions from the audience.
Ken's been waiting patiently.
Thank you, Elissa and Peter, for that wonderful conversation. And now it's time to open up the conversation to include your voices. It is our custom here at St. Mary's that when we do these kinds of talks, that we give initial preference for graduate students and undergraduate students to bring some questions forward first, and then we'll open it up to friends and acquaintances and colleagues. So we have a mic there that will have you bring up your questions, and please come forward. We got time.
Somebody's got to start, right?
Yes.
Mr. Senge, thank you so much for being here. I had the honor of
Yeah, that one's not on yet.
There we go. Now it is.
There, sounds good.
It's on. Okay,
There you go.
we're good. Okay. So yeah, I had the honor of working with you when you were here last year with the Pleasanton School District, and got to start marinating in some of these ideas about how we can rethink schools. And I was really interested in and moved in by the quote that you shared with us from the Tao Te Ching, that in the pursuit of gain, every day something is learned, and in the pursuit of the Tao, every day something is unlearned. And I wonder if you'd be willing to share with us something that you had to unlearn in your pursuit of systemic change and in the transformation of our systems.
Every day, right?
Every day. You could go on all night with this one, but just one would be appreciated.
Well, I mean, it's one way that I and probably most of us experience that is just the simple gesture of letting go, right? You've got a plan, you've got something that and let it go. I think that's been a steady unlearning for a long, long time, to the point now I think I'm not an easy person to work with, because I say, oh, let's just show up and see what happens. And, so that does tend to produce a lot of anxiety in some people. Gosh, there's just a lot of times when you just, I can think of something quite recent where, like the last half hour. We have a big meeting we've been planning for some time, and people are coming from several different places. Small meeting, but it's really it's quite strategic, and in what I'm hoping will be the beginnings of a real global network of people doing deep work in transforming education. There's a group coming from BC, from British Columbia, who do amazing work. And one of the lead people there is now not going to be able to come. I don't know why, but we really, really need her voice in this meeting. So, there's no point in getting upset about it. Maybe find out a little bit more if there's anything else we can do. But that's a small thing, I know. But if you look at the things that upset you, a lot of things that upset us are we expect this to happen and this doesn't happen. And we have an immediate flash of anger, disappointment. I had a teacher in China. One of the reasons I was in China all the time is I had a teacher there. And he used to say, there's this, of course, we all know, there's an old Chinese saying, blah, 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 right? You think, this is a country with a lot of old sayings. Well, it's true, it is. So this master gives a very precious vase to a student, and someone comes up and startles the student. He drops and the vase breaks, and the student goes ballistic. And the master says, "Why are you so upset? It's broken." So I mean, that's so much of our emotional, ups and downs, and so that unlearning, that letting go is just, you might say that's what life is asking of us all the time.
Invite some other questions. Excuse me, sir, undergraduate students and graduate students.
It's not an undergraduate.
Okay, we'll make an exception.
I'm only in high school. So I'm very curious and
Undergraduate
attracted.
student for 60 years.
We're counting how many years?
I just made it up.
Well, I'm interested in how these ideas you're talking about, art, creativity, resonance, creative process, how would you translate those into an MA in leadership and a doctorate in leadership?
Well, first thing, and I don't know enough about the program here. I think I'm going to probably say several things that are embedded in it from what I can see. First is, I would really make it all about doing. I mean, at the fundamental. So we say, well, leadership. Well, that's a big word, could mean a million different things. But, how much practical experience do you have working with people to bring about significant change? That would be my first goal in either master's or a doctoral program, would be a deep practical experience and designing the program around people being really immersed in truly challenging